My ex-wife sued me for half my inheritance while wearing pearls and looking innocent. She didn't know I had spent 5 years keeping every single receipt of her betrayal. She said she was a devoted partner. So I produced a notarized letter my grandfather wrote from beyond the grave. The moment her attorney read the first line, his face turned completely as crystal white. My grandfather, Henry Whitmore, built his life with a single truck and a work ethic that would embarrass most people half his age. In 1971, he started a regional logistics company out of a rented garage in South Philadelphia. No investors, no safety net, no family money to fall back on. Just Henry, a used flatbed, and a route he drove himself 6 days a week. By the time he sold the company in 2009, it was worth $38 million. But if you asked Henry what he was proudest of, he wouldn't mention the money. He'd tell you about the time he drove 4 hours through a February snowstorm to watch me walk across a stage and pick up my college diploma. He'd tell you about the Saturday afternoon he showed up at my first apartment with a toolbox because I'd mentioned a leak under the sink. He was 72 years old, and he fixed it himself in 40 minutes. Henry had one value above everything else: showing up. Not texting that you'd try to make it. Not sending a card. Actually being there, in the room, when it mattered. He paid attention to who came and who didn't, and he never forgot either. I met Renata when I was 28. We got married the following year. She was confident, sharp, the kind of person who could walk into any room and make it feel like she'd been there before. I thought that quality was something to admire. It took me a while to understand it was a performance, not a personality. In 5 years of marriage, Renata attended exactly 2 Whitmore family gatherings. 2. The first was Christmas. The year we got engaged, she posted 3 photos from that night on Instagram, hashtags and all. The second was Henry's 81st birthday party, where she arrived 40 minutes late, spent most of the time on her phone, and left before the cake came out, claiming a work emergency. That was it. That was the full extent of her presence in my family's life. Every other invitation I extended, she declined. I know the exact number because I have the thread. 23 messages over 57 months, dinners, holidays, Sunday afternoons at Henry's house in Chestnut Hill. 23 times I asked her to come. 23 different excuses. Headache. Work deadline. Prior commitment. Just need a night in. She had a remarkable range, I'll give her that. What I didn't know then was that Henry was keeping track too. I found out about Brock the way most people find out about things they weren't supposed to know, through a friend who couldn't stay quiet. Chloe had been in my life since college, and she texted me on a Friday night in March with no preamble, just a screenshot and 3 words. Is this Renata? It was. Renata and a man I didn't recognize, standing on a rooftop bar somewhere in Center City, drinks in hand, laughing. The kind of photo people post when they want to be seen having the best night of their lives. Her Instagram story. Timestamp 10:47 p.m., Friday, March 8th. I scrolled back in my messages. At 10:15 that same night, I had texted Renata asking if she needed anything. She told me earlier she was home with a migraine. She replied at 10:17 p.m. 2 minutes. Just resting. Love you. 30 minutes later, she was on a rooftop with her personal trainer. I didn't throw my phone. I didn't call her. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time and looked at those 2 messages side by side, her reply and the timestamp on that photo, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. When she got home, I showed her the screenshot. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just held up my phone and waited. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at me and said, "Are you seriously going through my Instagram right now?" Not a denial. Not an explanation. Just a redirect. Classic Renata when caught. Attack the method, not the fact. The divorce moved quickly. No children, no complicated assets at that point, and I didn't have the energy to fight over furniture. What mattered more to me was a conversation I had with Henry about 2 weeks after I moved out. I drove to the Chestnut Hill house on a Sunday afternoon and told him everything. He sat across from me at his kitchen table and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I saw it." That was all. 3 words. But the way he said them, steady, unsurprised, told me he wasn't talking about the Instagram photo. He had been watching Renata for years, noticing things I had been too close to see. What I didn't know yet was that he had also been keeping his own records. 2 emails sitting in a folder somewhere, and a phone call he had never mentioned to me, all from Renata, all about money. Henry never brought it up again. He didn't need to. Henry died on a Tuesday in late September, 3 years after the divorce. A stroke, quick and without warning, at 83 years old. I got the call at 6 in the morning and drove to Chestnut Hill in the dark. The house was exactly as he'd always kept it: tools in the garage, a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, like he'd just stepped out and planned to be back. The will was read 6 days later at the offices of Hargrove and Sloan, a firm Henry had used for decades. I sat across from my attorney Derek Hargrove in a conference room that smelled like old paper and wood polish, and listened as the document was read aloud. Henry left me the Chestnut Hill house, the full investment portfolio, and the remaining liquid assets. $30.2 million in total. My Aunt Patricia received a smaller bequest, a specific amount Henry had designated for her years ago. There was no mention of anyone else. What struck me, sitting in that room, wasn't the number. It was the date on the notarization. The will had been finalized 14 months before Henry died. 2 months after my divorce from Renata was complete. Henry hadn't updated his will in response to anything dramatic. He had simply looked at everything he knew, made his decision quietly, and signed his name. I drove home that afternoon and sat in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about that timing. I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt the specific weight of someone leaving you something they worked their whole life to build, and trusting you to carry it forward. I wasn't going to let that mean nothing. 6 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at my door. Renata, now represented by an attorney named Greaves, was contesting the estate. The filing ran to 11 pages. 2 primary arguments. First, that Renata had made material contributions to the Whitmore family relationship during our marriage and deserved recognition in the estate. Second, that Henry Whitmore had been unduly influenced by me during the final months of his life when the will was drafted. I read those 11 pages twice. I read the phrase material contributions to the family relationship and sat with it for a full minute. Renata had declined 23 family invitations over 5 years. She had left Henry's 81st birthday before the cake, and now she was asking a judge to treat that history as contribution. The claim was for $14.7 million. Exactly half the liquid portion of the estate. I set the filing down on the kitchen table, next to the certified letter envelope, and called Hargrove. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I was looking at. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "We need to start pulling everything together." I told him I already had. Pre-trial discovery took 3 months, and by the end of it I understood exactly what Greaves was building. He wasn't just going to argue that Renata deserved a share of the estate. He was going to argue that I had taken it from her. The theory was this. Henry Whitmore was an elderly man in his final years, emotionally close to his favorite grandson, and Callum Whitmore had used that closeness to poison his grandfather's opinion of Renata systematically, deliberately, over years until Henry cut her out of a will she would otherwise have appeared in. In other words, I was the manipulator. Renata was the victim. Greaves filed a motion requesting Henry's medical records from the final 18 months of his life. He was looking for anything that suggested cognitive decline, confusion, memory lapses, dependence on others. If he could establish that Henry wasn't fully lucid, he could argue the will itself was compromised. He also subpoenaed my phone records, looking for the frequency of my contact with Henry in his final year, trying to build a picture of calculated influence rather than a grandson who simply showed up. Hargrove walked me through the strategy on a Thursday afternoon in his office. He didn't sugarcoat it. "Greaves is good at this," he said. "He's going to make you look controlling and Henry look fragile. That's the whole play." He leaned back in his chair. Juries respond to that framing. They see an old man and a grieving woman, and they want to split the difference. Give her something to make the problem go away. He looked at me steadily. "If this goes to a jury, we're gambling." I told him it wasn't going to a jury. He asked me why I was so sure. I told him to wait. Renata's deposition was scheduled for February 19th. I wasn't in the room. That's not how depositions work, but Hargrove sent me the transcript that evening, and I read it at the kitchen table in the Chestnut Hill house with a cup of coffee that went cold before I was halfway through. Greaves had coached her well. When asked to describe her relationship with Henry Whitmore, Renata said, without hesitation, that she had treated him like a second father, that she had made every effort to be present for him, that her connection to the Whitmore family had been genuine, consistent, and meaningful throughout the marriage. When asked for specific examples, she cited the Christmas gathering. She described it in warm detail: the food, the conversation, the feeling of belonging. She mentioned Henry's 81st birthday and called it one of the most memorable evenings she could remember. I set the transcript down and looked across the table at nothing in particular. That same morning, my paralegal had finished the full catalog of the text thread. 23 declined invitations. 57 months. Every excuse documented, dated, and cross-referenced against Renata's calendar records, which had also been subpoenaed. Not a single conflict that held up. The Christmas she remembered so warmly? One night, Henry's birthday, she called memorable? She left before the cake and checked her phone 11 times in 40 minutes of detail I only knew because Henry had mentioned it to me, once, quietly, without complaint. The gap between what Renata had just said under oath and what the documents actually showed was not a gap. It was a canyon. And she had walked into it with total confidence and Olympic-level disdain for the idea that anyone had been paying attention. I picked up my phone and texted Hargrove 3 words. Get everything ready. Hargrove and I spent the next 6 weeks doing what I should have known from the very beginning of this marriage I would one day need to do. We built the case, piece by piece, document by document, until every claim Renata had made under oath had a direct and dated contradiction sitting across from it. The text thread came first. 23 messages, printed on 8 pages, each one annotated with the date, the stated reason for declining, and the corresponding entry from Renata's own subpoenaed calendar. Not one of the 23 had a legitimate conflict that held up. A work deadline that didn't exist in her calendar. A prior commitment with no corresponding entry. A migraine on a Friday evening that apparently cleared up in time for a rooftop bar. We flagged every discrepancy in red. The printout was 41 pages when we included the calendar cross-reference. Then came the social media exhibit. 7 Instagram posts in total, each one timestamped and placed side by side with the alibi Renata had given me on the same night. The rooftop photo from March 8th was the most straightforward 10:47 p.m. post, 10:17 p.m. text message saying just resting, love you. But there were 6 others, each telling the same story with slight variations. A birthday dinner she attended while I thought she was at a conference. A weekend trip she documented in detail while I believed she was visiting her sister. 7 posts. 7 lies. All of them still publicly available because Renata, apparently, had never considered that anyone would bother to look. Chloe submitted a sworn affidavit 4 pages, signed and notarized, describing what she had witnessed over the course of the marriage and what she had seen in the months before I found out about Brock. Mrs. Henderson, Henry's neighbor of 22 years, gave her own statement. She was 74 years old and precise in the way that people who pay attention tend to be. She stated that Renata had visited the Chestnut Hill house a total of 3 times in 5 years. Twice of those visits, she noted, coincided with a neighborhood charity event that had drawn local news cameras to the block. The 3rd time was a Sunday afternoon that lasted under 2 hours. The most devastating item in the envelope, though, was one I hadn't known existed until Hargrove pulled it from Henry's personal files during probate. 2 emails. Sent from Renata's personal account directly to Henry, not through me, not mentioned to me, handled entirely without my knowledge. The first was dated April 2019, the second, November 2019. Both were variations of the same request. Renata was developing a wellness real estate project and was looking for investors. She wanted Henry to consider putting in $200,000. She framed it warmly, the way she framed everything, lots of family language, lots of references to how much Henry meant to her. The second email was sent 4 months before I found out about Brock. 4 months before she told me she'd been resting at home with a migraine while she was on a rooftop with her personal trainer, who was, it turned out, also her business partner in this venture. She had been contacting my grandfather directly for investment capital while she was already sleeping with someone else. That was the full picture of Renata's meaningful contribution to the Whitmore family relationship. I stood at Hargrove's conference table looking at that second email for a long time. Then I put it in the envelope with everything else. Keep receipts. That's what the whole thing came down to. The letter was the last thing we added. Among gifts from Henry's, held in Hargrove's firm since probate, was a sealed envelope addressed in Henry's handwriting. The label read, "To whoever challenges this will." Hargrove told me it had been sitting in the file untouched since Henry's attorney filed it. It was notarized. It was witnessed. It was dated September 4th, 14 months before Henry died, 4 months after my divorce was finalized. Inside were 3 pages, written in Henry's careful, deliberate cursive. He had anticipated a contest. The letter explained, in plain and specific language, exactly why I was the sole heir. He mentioned the 2 emails Renata had sent him asking for investment capital. He noted her pattern of absence from family gatherings. He described her behavior at his 81st birthday, and I felt something tighten in my chest when I read it, because Henry had clocked everything I only found out secondhand. He wrote, without sentimentality, she checked her phone 11 times in 40 minutes and left before the cake. Then, 2 paragraphs later, he wrote the words that I read 3 times before I could move on. Callum always showed up. That is what integrity looks like. That is what I'm rewarding. The phrase integrity matters sat in that second paragraph like a quiet verdict. Henry hadn't written it for a courtroom. He had written it because it was true and he wanted the record to reflect it. I closed the folder and slid it across the table to Hargrove. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Henry had been watching for years, and he had written every single bit of it down. Hargrove was honest with me in a way I appreciated, even when it was uncomfortable. We were 3 weeks out from the hearing when he sat me down and walked through the risks without softening any of them. Greaves was going to lead with the undue influence theory and push it hard. He would try to get Henry's medical records from his final 18 months admitted into evidence, looking for any documentation of cognitive decline, a confused phone call, a missed appointment, a note from a doctor that could be reframed as fragility. If he found anything usable, he would argue that Henry's letter, the will itself, all of it, was the product of a compromised mind being guided by a calculating grandson. He would paint me as someone who had spent years carefully separating his grandfather from everyone else in the family until Henry had no perspective left but mine. He's going to call you manipulative, Hargrove said. And he's going to call Henry vulnerable. That's the whole play. He leaned back in his chair. Juries respond to that framing. They see an old man and a grieving woman, and they want to split the difference. Give her something to make the problem go away. He looked at me steadily. I need you to understand that we are not guaranteed a favorable outcome here. I told him I understood. I also told him I wasn't worried. He asked me why. I told him to look at the envelope. There was one thing I had decided early in the process, and I had not wavered on it. Hargrove's retainer was $35,000. I paid it entirely from my personal savings account money I had earned before the inheritance, money that had nothing to do with Henry's estate. I documented every payment, every transfer, every date, every confirmation number. If Greaves wanted to argue that I was using Henry's money to fund my own defense, he was going to find a paper trail that said otherwise. I wasn't going to give him anything he could use. That was the discipline the whole situation required. Keep your hands clean. Log everything. Don't improvise. 2 days before the hearing, Greaves sent a settlement offer. It arrived at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday, forwarded to me by Hargrove with a single line, "Your call." The offer was $4 million and a mutual NDA. Renata would drop the suit. I would pay, stay quiet, and move on. I read it twice. The NDA was the part that told me everything I needed to know about what Renata was actually afraid of. It wasn't the money. She had done the math and decided that $4 million in hand was safer than letting the hearing happen. The clause was specific. I would be prohibited from discussing the lawsuit, the circumstances of the estate, or the contents of the will with any third party. She wanted the story buried. I called Hargrove that evening and told him no. He asked if I was sure. I said I was. He sent the response the next morning at 9. 3 sentences. Offer declined. We'll see you in court. She had offered me silence for $4 million. I'd already decided the only thing I wanted was the truth on the record. Courtroom 3B of the Philadelphia County Courthouse smells like old wood and recycled air. The overhead lights hum at a frequency that becomes background noise after about 10 minutes, and the benches are the kind of hard that makes you aware of your spine. I had been in the building twice before in my life, once for jury duty, once to file a document for Henry's probate. Neither time had felt like this. Renata was already seated at the plaintiff's table when I walked in. Charcoal blazer, pearl earrings. Her posture was perfect and her expression was composed, the kind of composed that takes practice. She looked like someone with absolutely nothing to hide. She did not look at me. Greaves opened for the plaintiff. He was smooth, measured, and very good at his job. He told Judge Hartwell that Renata Whitmore had been a devoted partner to the Whitmore family throughout her marriage, that she had contributed meaningfully to relationships that directly shaped Henry Whitmore's affections and, ultimately, his estate decisions, that she had been excluded from a will she had every reasonable expectation of appearing in, not because of any failure on her part, but because of the calculated influence of a grandson who had positioned himself as the sole conduit to an elderly man in his final years. He spoke for 22 minutes. Two of the jurors were nodding by minute 8. I kept my eyes on the manila envelope on Hargrove's table and said nothing. Then Hargrove stood up. He started with the text thread. He didn't read all 23 messages, he read 4. He chose them carefully, one from Thanksgiving, one from Henry's 82nd birthday, one from a Sunday dinner in July, one from Christmas the following year. Each one an invitation from me, each one a decline from Renata, each one with a reason that her own subpoenaed calendar did not support. He read them slowly, clearly, without commentary. He let the dates and the words do the work. Then he moved to the social media exhibit. He described each post precisely location, timestamp, occasion, and read the corresponding text message Renata had sent me on the same night. The rooftop bar. From March 8th. The birthday dinner, she called a conference. The weekend trip she documented publicly while telling me she was visiting her sister. 7 posts. 7 messages. He read them in pairs, one after the other, and the courtroom was very quiet by the time he reached the 4th pair. Greaves objected twice. Both times Judge Hartwell overruled without elaboration. Then Hargrove called Mrs. Henderson. She walked to the stand slowly but without hesitation. 74 years old, 22 years as Henry's neighbor, and completely unintimidated by the room. Hargrove asked her how many times she had seen Renata visit the Chestnut Hill house during the period of the Whitmore marriage. She thought for a moment, then said 3. Hargrove asked if she was confident in that number. She said yes. She said she would have remembered more visits because Renata was always so well dressed, and she would have noticed. 2 of the 3 visits, she added without being prompted, happened on the same weekend that local news cameras were on the block for a neighborhood charity event. Greaves cross-examined her for 6 minutes and got nothing useful. Then Hargrove asked Judge Hartwell for permission to read a document into the record. He described it. A handwritten letter, 3 pages, authored by Henry Whitmore, notarized and witnessed, dated September 4th, found sealed among Henry's personal papers and addressed, in Henry's own hand, to whoever challenges this will. Greaves objected on authenticity grounds. Hargrove produced the notarization certificate, the witness signatures, and the chain of custody documentation from the probate filing. Judge Hartwell reviewed it for 90 seconds, then looked at Greaves and said, "Objection overruled. You may proceed." Hargrove read it slowly. Henry's voice came through in every sentence plain, direct, without sentiment, without performance. He described Renata's 2 investment solicitation emails. He noted her pattern of absence. He recorded the details of his 81st birthday in precise, quiet language. And then Hargrove reached the passage I had read 3 times at the conference table 2 months ago, and he read it aloud in courtroom 3B of the Philadelphia County Courthouse, in front of Judge Hartwell and both parties, in the record. Callum always showed up. That is what integrity looks like. That is what I'm rewarding. The room was completely silent. I looked at Renata for the first time since I had walked in. Her expression had changed not into guilt, not into regret, but into something harder and smaller. The blank, compressed look of someone who has just understood, too late, that the person they spent years underestimating had been keeping a record she didn't know existed. Judge Hartwell set down her pen and looked directly at Renata. And I thought, Henry always said the truth had a way of showing up, eventually, whether you invited it or not. Judge Hartwell delivered her ruling 12 minutes after both sides rested. 12 minutes. I had expected to wait longer. I sat at the defense table and watched the clock on the wall and thought about nothing in particular until the door opened and everyone stood. The undue influence theory was rejected. Henry's letter, the court found, demonstrated clear, coherent, and independently documented reasoning, the reasoning of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. The material contribution claim was rejected. The text record, the witness testimony, and the social media documentation established a consistent and verifiable pattern of absence that directly contradicted Renata's claims under deposition. The estate remained intact, and Renata was ordered to pay legal fees $47,000, the full cost of Hargrove's representation. Greaves was already reorganizing his files by the time the gavel came down. Renata did not look at me. I thanked Hargrove quietly, shook his hand, and walked out of courtroom 3B into the late afternoon light on the courthouse steps. The air outside was cold and very clean. I stood there for a moment and let it settle. In the weeks that followed, I heard through Chloe that the wellness real estate venture, the The project Renata had tried to pitch to Henry for $200,000, the one she had been building with Brock, while she was still married to me, had collapsed entirely. Brock had moved on. Renata was back in a studio apartment in South Philly. The charcoal blazer and pearl earrings, Chloe mentioned with a particular kind of precision, had been rented for the court date. That November, I hosted Christmas at the Chestnut Hill house for the first time. All the people Henry had loved, the ones who had actually shown up, year after year, the ones whose names did not appear in 23 declined text messages. I set one extra place at the table, in the chair where Henry used to sit. I didn't make a speech about it. I didn't need to. My grandfather built everything he had by showing up and doing the work and letting the record speak for itself. He taught me that integrity matters, not as a slogan, not as something you perform for photographs, but as the quiet, daily choice to be present when it counts. He kept his own receipts. He trusted that the truth would surface when it needed to. Turns out, he was right about everything.